Boardroom Bound, episode 100. Boardroom Bound's best moments, a look back at the first 100 episodes. Hello and welcome to this special episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. Today's note is a celebration for a couple reasons. This is 100 episodes for us, and that has flown by, but it's also Thanksgiving here. And I have so much to be grateful for that I got to spend the last 100 episodes talking to leading thinkers and practitioners in the boardroom. And I'm a simple governance geek. I had so much fun doing that. But at the same time, we were able to bring out so many great ideas for all of you, my listeners. You are eager to be doing your best self in the boardroom, getting those board seats, and these are the people that can help you. I had trouble picking out which 11 to feature today. Some of the leading names that you'll know in the industry, Peter Gleason, Julie Daum, Betsy Atkins, people like that you're going to get to hear from again today. I'm so excited to bring this to you today. Let's jump into the show. And remember, this is my Thanksgiving treat to you because I'm grateful that you've been spending the last 100 episodes with me. Our first guest reappearance is by Martha Josephson. She's a partner at Egon Zehnder. She's going to share with us how filling board seats is synonymous to casting the different parts in a play. And I like the way you've described it there. You've described it to me before. It's like you're casting a play when you're trying to fill the board seats. It's this probably a careful dance. You're trying to make sure that you have all the people with the right qualifications that are going to work really well, efficiently, and effectively together for the amount of work they've got to get done in a short period of time. That can't be an easy thing to do.
Well, and it's changed. So it used to, if you think about casting the play, it used to be that boards were cast with 8 to 10 Hamlets, and those Hamlets were white male public company CEOs. Mm-hmm. And the play worked for a long, long time, but then the world got more complicated, and you didn't need a room full of white male CEOs. You needed some diversity. You needed Ophelia. You needed not to draw this too far, but you needed different roles to be played by spiky experts rather than CEO generalists. Now, you still want a couple of the really experienced CEOs in the room. They're great coaches to the CEO who's reporting into this board. But, you know, the world got complicated, and now you need maybe risk. Mm-hmm. Maybe you need digital. Maybe if you're doing business, heaven help you, in China or Russia, you need somebody who understands those markets or global markets in general. Mm-hmm. Maybe you need somebody who's done a lot of M&A in their career if you're moving towards an inorganic growth component to your strategy. And all of these people are not going to be CEOs of public companies. So what we've found is that in our quest to diversify not just the gender of boards, not just the skin color or ethnic background of boards, but really the expertise that each individual board member brings to that room. And that's that kind of diversity. Oh, and even age diversity. For a big client, we recently placed a 30-year-old private company CEO that was smack dab in the middle of understanding how the demographics of their tech business will change. So what you've got is a much more complicated world and much more complicated thinking around board composition.
Our second guest returning today is Betsy Atkins, and she is a board member extraordinaire. In fact, she is the second most tenured female board member in the history of our country, and she's going to offer some insights on how to formulate a path to the boardroom and what actionable steps you can be taking right now to make that happen.
Well, I think in anything that you want to do in life, you need to have a plan and an objective and a goal, but you have to have actually a lot of business development behind making the goal happen. You know, you have to be focused and figure out, well, what would be the channels or the pathways for me to get on a board? So the obvious one is, executive search. Mm-hmm. certainly professional investors, private equity and venture capital, increasingly are adding independent board members. There are the activists. They nominate board slates. There are the big institutional funds, which now, have a pretty good-sized internal corporate governance group that are influencers. And then look at the ecosystem around the board. So that's the public accounting firms, the law firms, the banking firms. All of those are channels that you can cultivate. And then most importantly, your own, if you're a senior executive in a company, you have both peers and you have a CEO or a manager who could help you. You may have exposure to your company's board where they might be able to help and guide you. So there's a pretty broad set of touch points to build a business development around, to cultivate for yourself the channels to get a board opportunity. So, for example, every quarter, the CEO and the CFO have an earnings call. And those are out there, and you can download them and listen to them. And if you listen to them and if you get the script, which you can do, you'll hear what's important to the CEO and CFO. You'll hear the tone about the culture of, is it a visionary, inspirational company? Is it an operationally driven company that's financially driven? Is it an innovation culture company? You'll hear these themes in the earnings call if you listen to them. And you'll also hear, which will give you a sense for the culture, you'll also hear the unique sort of glossary or phraseology that every company has, like their own internal secret speak.
Right.
There'll be pet phrases that the CEO will use, pet phrases that the CFO will mirror and use. And if you can absorb that phraseology and that culture and that sort of cadence of how they think and communicate, it'll be a very much more effective meeting when you go to the interview to be able to mirror some of that back. And I think the biggest thing in an interview is that you should spend 60, 70% listening and learning, not presenting why you're great, because those aren't good meetings. You have an opportunity to hear what they think is important in a board member, what they think is the culture of their board, what they think are the opportunities and challenges for the company. And if you're walking on their words and you're not listening, then subconsciously they come away saying, this person doesn't listen very well. I think it's really important to make the time to visit with each of your board members one-on-one, by phone or video call, or better yet, in person, like right before the board meeting. Try and have a breakfast or a coffee. There's a lot of sort of institutional knowledge and memory about the company, and you can learn so much about what the culture is, what have the opportunities been, what's the market dynamics, and what's the boardroom dynamics. And by doing that, you learn a lot, you build one-on-one relationships, and you'll have a sense of where you're a little different and complementary from your fellow board colleagues, so you can figure out what, where you should opine and contribute. So I think that's a very important step in how do you be an effective board member, is to continue to do your homework and to be in touch with your board colleagues in between the board meetings, not just at the board meeting. And then there's a whole lot you can do to be prepared to actually go into the board meetings themselves beyond what the company gives you.
Our third reappearance of a guest is Coco Brown, and she's going to talk about how beneficial casting a wide net can be, especially for those young aspiring directors who might not yet be in the C-suite.
Yeah, it's really interesting because during those 10 years, 12 years that I was on the board, for the first 10 of those where I was also running the company, I never really thought of the board as being this separate entity because, it was a 3-person board. of the three owners of the company. We were fully self-funded. We never took any external funding that would bring in outside board members. So there were a lot of ways in which it was a fluid extension of my day job, if you will, and I didn't really think about it in a standalone context until I stepped down from running the company and now was an outside board member, if you will. I was still, one of the owners of the company, but I had this external role now. And that was the first time I really started thinking about the board as its own complete separate entity, interestingly enough, from my own perspective. However, the real eye-opener for me around board service as a career and board service as a higher echelon kind of reach for leaders who want to do more than, reach the C-suite, who want to go beyond the C-suite. I started really thinking about that when I was invited to a roundtable discussion with Senator Mark Warner, who is in Silicon Valley, visiting from Virginia, getting into the hearts and minds of Silicon Valley. And one of the sessions he had was a discussion with female leaders in the area. There were about 20 of us that were invited to this conversation with the senator. And he asked us, what's on your mind? And we immediately went to the boardroom. And it was stunning to me to see these women who had held and were holding very big, significant roles in well-known companies who were frustrated at the lack of the visibility to them and consideration of them for board seats. And I got a flurry of emails the next day saying, hey, Coco, you've been trying to figure out what to do next. And the directive came to me specifically because back in 2004, when I, 2 years into me now fully running house, I had my own version of imposter syndrome where, I was questioning myself, thinking, gosh, I was a psychology major. I've never touched a line of code in my life, and here I am running a deeply technical company. And it's one thing to do a turnaround, which is what I was brought in to do at that time from the dot-com bust, and to keep us out of bankruptcy. But now I'm running a real going concern again, and I'm rebuilding this thing. And do I really deserve to be at the helm here? And then also looking around at all of my customers and also our consultants, almost all of whom were men. So I had all these reasons to doubt myself. And so I had started a dinner group with female CIOs, Chief Information Officers, because I would meet one and she'd say, well, I'm the only one in the Valley. And so I started saying, you're not. So it's really hard for her to be found. She's also not an officer of the company. So if you look at just sort of the pure spec kinds of things, boards will say, well, we want somebody who's an officer of the company. We want somebody who, has a C-level title, et cetera, and these things would sort of put her out of running. So she may look like a 33% match to something that she's a perfect match for. Now, she just joined through Athena, a $15 billion market cap public company. That she would not have had exposure to her and vice versa if it weren't for the way that we expose opportunities to our members so that they can raise their hand properly and say, hey, here's how you position me for this. And so that's super important. And the reason it's also so important is because if you look at the whole, there's the very visible companies will have executive search engaged with them. The companies that are about to go public or that are large publics. But usually those executive search firms are managing a process, and the board itself is still sourcing from their network. And they're casting a wide net. The recruiters are helping them do that. But they're bringing in candidates from their own network as well. And those candidates from their own networks are not meeting a spec and ultimately are the ones who are chosen. And that's just for where there are recruiters involved. Most of the time there is no recruiter involved. And so most people who join boards don't end up meeting 5 out of 5 on a spec. They end up meeting maybe 3, and then because they're well known, the board comes up with other reasons for why that person should fit. And so we're just giving women the opportunity to do the same thing by putting the opportunity in front of them and letting them shape the narrative to say, here's how to position me, here's how I fit.
In this next bit, we hear from Paul Smith, and he is the founder of the Future Directors Institute down in Australia, and he's speaking on the importance of building trust within your network as a young, aspiring director.
But essentially, our tribe is governance. So, that's why boards have been recruited like that. And so we help the next generation understand that in many places, that's what they're having to break into. So if trust is the currency that they've got to break into or break through, then how can they actually create credibility and trust from within that group? And that comes through the actions you're taking, the conversations you're having, the network you're also developing. Like personally, I don't like the way that most boards are recruited in terms of, the route of least resistance, which is, hi, Alex, I know you, come and join our board because I know you, I trust you probably do a good job, but you're not probably going to kick up a fuss. That's the way that most boards are recruited, because most boards don't have resources to hire recruitment companies or to put, paid ads out there and the time to filter hundreds of applications. However, so we have to teach people how to work within that system, which is to find yourself in the right place at the right time with the right credibility, with the right community around you who are basically mentoring and sponsoring you into those roles. And that means you have to build trust within that network. And then once you've built that trust within that network, and you may already, and the whole point of the people we're working with, they've probably already built a lot of that trust already, then you then have a level of trust with the potential board that you join, even if there's a second degree of connection there.
There's obviously some challenges that are faced by new board directors in their journey. I would love if we could unpick a bit of that, because I'm sure that's some of the stuff that the group that you're working with is struggling with.
Yeah, and it's interestingly, a lot of the work that I'm doing now is we're continuing to do the work in terms of helping aspiring directors to become board directors. And now we're starting to work a lot more with those who are already on boards, whether they're part of our community or from outside. And they're relatively new to the board, and what are the challenges they're facing. Now, we just co-authored a report with Diligent, the board software company, around and Spencer Stuart around onboarding new directors, because Spencer Stuart are finding there's an increasing uptake of new directors in the S&P 500 where it's their actual first board role, and the importance of onboarding and orientation are quite there. And again, that's one of the key challenges for new directors is there's no orientation, there's no onboarding. You're just assumed that you can just hit the ground running. And therefore, you're sort of behind the eight ball straight away.
Our next section features Mark Pfister, also known as the board architect. Mark is discussing finding the right fit for your boardroom and how tricky it can be. And can you talk about also from the perspective of being on the board and the board member of the nominating committee, where you're trying to find that right fit because you don't want to bring in someone who you're not sure about because they might upset the apple cart?
Absolutely, and it's a tricky space, because I personally don't mind the agitator as long as they are doing it in a respectful way.
Right.
But if that agitation is due to a mismatch of values or a mismatch of culture, for that matter, then I think that is a totally different topic and probably a showstopper for that person coming onto the board.
I'm with you. So if we think about someone's coming from the agitator from a perspective of constructive criticism, of maybe this is a way we should consider doing something else versus just trying to lob a grenade in to see what happens.
That's right. And one of the things we'll talk about shortly is, to me, everything that you're mentioning right now has a direct tie to EQ, or emotional intelligence, and also to mindfulness, or what they say, MQ, mindfulness intelligence. It's all, if you are feeling attacked in a certain scenario, how are your emotions? How are you dealing with that? How is your response? Are you falling into the trap of attacking back? Or are you able, with your emotional intelligence, to say, I've been in this scenario before. I understand why this person is on a different side, possibly, of the issue. I understand why they're agitated, and I'm going to keep my cool and explain my position and explain my case in a very diplomatic way. That, to me, is truly the emotional intelligence side to this. And it's not something someone can read a book on and be good at that overnight. It takes time, and it takes scenarios where you're put into that spot to truly hone that skill set. And, you really have a lot of constituents when you're in a board director seat. And that's where, again, if we parlay the emotional intelligence or the EQ component now to the mindfulness side, the mindfulness piece to this is more, I view it more as the proactive version of saying, are you aware and in tune with the things that could affect your decisions, or is there emotion attached to this? Are you stepping back and are you looking at what are these outside forces that may be guiding you down a path for a decision or for any outcome? And just the ability to kind of step back or look at yourself and the board from that 30,000-foot viewpoint, that to me is mindfulness. It's truly understanding the inputs and the possible conditioning in how you're making your decisions. And I think that's a super important concept for a board candidate, not to mention a board director, to be aware of.
I like that a lot. It's interesting because most of us think about, if we're talking about boards, we're probably talking about strategy and governance, and those are very important. And you're talking about another topic, which is great because that's an essential part of how you be successful, but also perhaps how you get your candidacy across. But let's go back to that level that someone would think about for a second. I'm going to be a board member. I'll deal with a lot of strategy. Maybe I am noses in and fingers out. That's my new approach. Help people understand what that actually looks like and the importance of the strategy and governance.
Sure. So I will tell you that I have taken some heat in the past, especially when my book came out, in the fact that I put the component or the importance of strategy in a board director's repertoire higher than the governance component, and there's a reason for that. So typically to date, if you had a synonymous word with board director, the first thing people would think about is governance. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I believe that governance is actually a byproduct of the strategy of the organization or the strategy at the board level. So a board itself should have its own strategy. How are we going to guide the CEO? How are we going to keep transparency into the company's environment? How are we going to structure our board committees to make sure that we have serious input and valid input to guide this organization and the CEO?
It's interesting you say that. I remember one of our previous guests, Steve Bartlett, was talking about he insists that every board he joins, even if it's not their practice, they add an executive session at the beginning and the end of all of their board days so that they together can talk about what was our strategy, what do we need to do differently. Maybe it's guidance to the CEO, how do we change that? And that's the way they've built in to be able to do that. Does that sound like a good example of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And I'm always smiling when I hear this because I know that board has their structure probably very correctly structured in their environment. So to me, many times I hear boards talking about the fact that they are in their governance mode or they're there to only govern. And I ask them what they're governing, and what they tell me back are tasks. And, if I truly break those down, I see tasks. But to me, you have to know what you're governing. Typically, you're governing two things. You're governing the goals of the organization through, number two, the strategy. The strategy is the how. The goals are the what, and the strategy is the how. If a board does not know those two things or had some sort of involvement in it and some sort of ownership, mainly of the strategy, they're not able to govern it. They don't know the how. You're governing the how when you look at a board of directors.
Julie Daum, who's a partner and co-practice leader of the board and CEO practice at Spencer Stuart, offers a look into the boardroom's ideal candidate and how it's changed over time.
Well, there's two questions there. In terms of the ideal candidate, that has evolved over time. But one ideal candidate that for every board thinks about and has since I've started working with them is they want people who are active CEOs or retired CEOs, people who sat in that chair and understand what it's like to have employees and investors and everything else that goes along with that. So that's still the number one thing that boards are looking for. But it has, as I said, it has changed over the years in addition to that. Boards are looking for people who have strong financial expertise, who've been CFOs or maybe an audit partner, but more operating financial executives. And then these days we have a lot of boards in every industry wanting people who have strong technology backgrounds and digital backgrounds. Some of that is the changing nature of business. It's important to every company. And the other reason is that experience does not rest in boardrooms right now. Mm-hmm. Board members tend to be older, and a lot of what's happened in the digital and tech world has happened since many of them were working. So it's a gap right now in U.S. boardrooms. So those are the things we look for: CEOs, CFOs, and then people who have digital and tech backgrounds.
And in terms of those candidates, the sort of ideal background, I imagine there might be some of our people listening who are sort of just outside the C-suite, sort of the up and coming in that space. They might already run a division, have a large P&L, and they would probably argue analogous experience to a CEO. When you get someone who reaches out to you and says, unlike a CEO, I have a lot of the relevant experience, I'd love to know what your reaction is. I could see it ranging from, yes, that could fit with a smaller company that's as representative of perhaps the division you run, to why don't you wait till you make the next promotion, and then we'll talk. How do you respond?
So it's a great question, because, and I don't have a simple answer. First of all, CEOs these days are reluctant to serve on boards. So if you look at the statistics, 60% of, it just depends on the candidate pool, or the company size, but more than half of CEOs, active CEOs, do not serve on an outside board. So when I started, they all served on 3 outside boards. Right. So that candidate pool has shrunk. So you can't necessarily say, I want an active CEO of a company bigger than ours. So then boards have to think about it. Well, if I can't get that, what is it that I want? And is it a retired CEO, or is it an up-and-coming executive who has the potential to be a CEO one day and who also has significant operating experience? I think the way you just put it was perfect. You do need to build whether a personal brand, or something. You need to be known, and that can be from being known in your industry, participating in an industry association. It could be writing something that's insightful about what's going on, or, as you said, writing something for a newspaper. But you do need to be known, and different people do that different ways. And some of it is, some people are very comfortable getting out there and speaking on issues. Other people spend their time trying to get to know people who are in the boardroom and using their network to network into other boards. But for a search firm, we do just what he said, I think. We really try hard to figure out who's good at whatever it is we're looking for.
Up next, we have Matthew Roberts, who is the CEO of InTouch, discussing how the role of board members is changing. There's a lot of really awesome opportunity here, but it's a different opportunity. Can you talk about what you guys see for the U.S. market that brought you over here and how you're working in this space?
I think it is very different, but I also think the role of a board member and the role of a non-executive director is one that is changing and one that is transitioning, and it's becoming less. It will always be a highly regulated position, but I believe that the role of a non-executive director and a board member is to really help a company get from A to B, and you can surround yourselves, like we do ourselves at InTouch, with fantastic experience and people who've been there and done it, and that can help an organization, again using that expression from an on it rather than in it perspective. Mm-hmm. And when you're running a business and driving a business every single day, it can be often very difficult to see what's directly in front of you. And I think organizations of any size, it doesn't have to be a Fortune 1000 business. It can be a business of any scale that needs that person to come in and look at a business strategically and help entrepreneurs, help CEOs, help owners to drive the business forward.
And now we'll hear from Dottie Schindlinger. She is the Executive Director of the Diligent Institute and co-host of the Corporate Director podcast for Diligent Corporation. Dottie is speaking on their guide for the modern corporate board director and why acknowledging wins but also learning from losses is so important.
Wanted to understand, it's called a guide for the modern corporate board director. We wanted to have something that would help directors really understand the way that they can keep up when your entire business model could shift based on a tweet that morning.
Right.
So we wanted to write something about those issues. But like any book that has anything to do with technology, almost the minute that you turn the manuscript into the publisher, it's outdated. So we were really thinking, we got to do something to try to keep these issues current and keep it meaningful and relevant to corporate directors. So we decided we'd start a podcast. And, we wanted to at first just make sure we got people on the podcast that had contributed in some way to the book and get their voices heard. But as we started to look around to see what podcasts were already out there on corporate governance issues, we were pretty surprised how few there were. Every company, good, bad, and ugly, has wins, has things that are good that we could all learn from. And especially if you're speaking, from directors to other directors, there are definitely things that they could potentially share of practices that are happening in their boardroom that have had a really positive impact. And even in situations where they've been through some trouble, we want to know how they're turning it around, right? We want to know what are they doing differently now to try to make sure that whatever that bad thing was doesn't happen again. And I just feel like there's not enough attention paid to the stuff we do right. And partly that's I think we all get much more excited about the stuff that goes wrong. I think it tends to be a little sexier, in terms of media coverage. But if we're doing something that's for directors, I feel like the opposite is true. I feel like what they really desperately want and what they're telling us that they want is, tell me what to do about it. Tell me what I can do differently or better. I should never do that. Got it. But that leaves the whole world of other possibilities. What's the right strategy? So we wanted to try to provide a platform for those kinds of conversations.
Peter Gleason, CEO of the National Association of Corporate Directors, NACD as we call it, is next up offering some insight on why it's important to ask the tough questions as a board director.
We always say that directors need to ask the tough questions, and that's where, especially in good times, it's easy to ask tough questions when things are going south. But if things are going well and you're not probing, does this make sense? Do your assumptions still hold water? Are we pressure testing them appropriately? You got to ask those tough questions. I think the diversity of the perspectives is going to be a competitive advantage, and that's where we've got to look at it. It really is broadening the spectrum, broadening the lens that we look at our long-term value creation mechanisms through. And whatever those mechanisms may be, whatever the strategic objective is, having a variety of different thoughts, experiences to bring to bear on how we're going to plan this out, how we're going to execute on it, to me is we have to look at diversity as a competitive advantage, and that's the only way to really focus in on it. And I think it's going to change how we do business in a lot of different ways by adding different perspectives, by creating new products and services, and really being much more mindful of competitive issues that, again, I kind of mentioned this before, but our competitors today are not necessarily the traditional ones we've always thought of.
In our next segment, we're hearing from the CEO of 2020 Women on Boards, Betsy Atkins, as she shares a bit about her passion of advancing more women to corporate board seats.
Well, I'm, as you can tell, passionate about the issue to advance more women to corporate boards, Alexander, and this started for me about 25 years ago. I own a retained executive search firm in Los Angeles called Berkmer Clayton, and we've been doing board searches for years, as well as senior management searches ever since I started the company. And we have a diversity focus in our search firm because it was launched out of the racial strife that we had here in Los Angeles back in 1992. And of course, it's come full circle once again with the focus on diversity, and rightfully so, and hopefully this time the country can get it right. But I was curious way back when why there weren't more women on corporate boards, and so I started to gather a group in Los Angeles and Orange County here in California of women I knew who served on boards, and then I found a few more, but it was a very small group, like 10. We got together twice a year to have dinner and talk about why there aren't more women on board. So this began a serious investigation, if you will, and finding out from my corporate client companies why they didn't have more women on their boards. And really it just got down to, even back then, as it still is today, networking. That the predominantly men who are on the boards don't have women in their circles of contacts whom they know through business. They might know women in personal associations like universities or golf clubs, etc., but they haven't really been exposed, or back then, to women in business. Now that has changed a great deal, and much of that has to do with the campaign 2020 Women on Boards to continually lift up the issue and advocate and collaborate with companies to encourage them to reach out to greater circles of influence so that they can meet more women who would be excellent board members.
So in addition to working in this space, you've also been sitting in those sorts of seats, which you bring that thought process to bear as well.
Yes, and those are nonprofit boards or advisory boards that I've served on many over my career. And I always recommend, especially as you know through our Get On Board workshop with 2020 Women on Boards, I always recommend that women in their 30s, early in their career, get involved with nonprofit organizations in their cities in order to make contact, to help the nonprofit organization do what it does and provide the services it does, but also to get to know corporate people who serve on those nonprofit boards, and therefore they'll get to know you, and that means you'll be in their circles of contacts when they think about whom they might later on bring onto their corporate boards. Sometimes relationships, as you know, take 10 years or 15 years to really nurture and gee, in my advanced career, I'm still nurturing relationships that I started way back then in my early nonprofits. In fact, back when I was in my 30s, I served on the nonprofit board of the March of Dimes here in Southern California, and then I became chair of that board because, of course, you volunteer, and then you get to you raise your hands to say yes all the time, then you end up being the chair of the board. So one of the members of the nonprofit March of Dimes was Ron Williams, who is at the time was the president of Blue Cross of California. He then moved back east. He became the CEO of Aetna, and then now he's on the board of 3 boards: Boeing, Johnson & Johnson, and American Express. And that's a relationship that I developed way back in my 30s, and now I was able to call Ron and say, Ron, we need you on our international broadcast for 2020 Women on Boards, the global conversation, and he said yes right away, so he's going to be on that broadcast. And so these relationships that all of you in the audience are developing with some strategy and sometimes just luck, really do become fruitful in your advanced career. So, and you never know where it's going to take you. Because certainly when I got involved on the March of Dimes board back in my 30s, I never ever thought I never had an idea where my career was going to lead me. In fact, at that time I was in the PR business, not the executive search business. So that's what I advise all your listeners, Alexander, is to be open to what might happen when you develop relationships through your nonprofit boards or your university your university trustees. If you've gone to business school, definitely be active in the alumni association. Those are golden contacts that people develop their careers parallel to yours as time goes by, and you never know when they're going to think about you and bring you back onto or invite you to one of their corporate boards. It's a excellent. Serving on nonprofit boards or advisory boards is an excellent way to make good business contacts that can really, really affect your career later on.
Last but not least, Sheila Ronning, the founder of Women in the Boardroom, discusses her mission of getting senior-level executive women into the boardroom and also adds some insight on nonprofit boards.
Sometimes I'll have people say, oh, you're helping women become board ready. And I'm like, no, these women are definitely board ready. We're just helping them package themselves, if you will, right? Whether it's they need to have that, value add, that elevator pitch. They, really the networking, as you know, is so huge and, plays such a huge role in getting onto a corporate board. So that, and plus then all the connections I've made over the years, with all those board members. And even though we're not a search firm, they do send us in their board openings, and we provide a lot of knowledge. So we're there every step of the way, whether it's, helping them package to get to the interview, helping them with the interview, and of course, once they're there, helping them be the best board member possible. The nonprofit route, I always say, listen, I don't want women to stop doing their charitable work at all, but, a lot of times women will feel like, oh, I need to be on a nonprofit board first. Oh, I need to get another degree, or I need to become certified, all these different things that they tell themselves where they're not checking all the boxes. So, I get asked that question all the time, does serving on a nonprofit board help me get onto a corporate board? And my response is always, maybe. And that's if, one, it's a large nonprofit board, if it's a well-run board so that you're learning good governance. And I'm mentioning all these things, too, just because if your listeners are getting onto those nonprofit boards as a starting ground, just to make sure that they kind of have all these boxes checked so that it will help them, whether it's they're wanting to advance to the next level in their career or onto the board. But again, so large nonprofit board, a well-run board so they're learning good governance. Of course, they need to make sure they're passionate about the mission, but take a leadership role and, of course, show up. And really make sure you know what the expectations are, the give and get. Do you need to write out a check for $50,000, or do you need to be fundraising for $100,000? And also the time commitment. Is it, do they want you around for 5 hours a month, or 5 hours a week? And is it for 1 year or 5 years? Really figure out what that time commitment is that they're expecting from you as well. And then the last thing I always just tell our members too is to make sure there's men at the table, because you want to make sure you're using that as a networking opportunity.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed thinking about this as my Thanksgiving gift to all of you. What I'm so grateful for is that I got to spend 100 episodes talking to some of the leading thinkers in the board space. I could only pick out 11. We didn't have time to have all of the 100 back on today, and we just had little snippets of what they were talking about. I would encourage you to listen to their full episodes because there's so much genius content that we can all leverage within them. And not just those 11, the 100 episodes that we have already are just packed with insights for all of you. And that's exactly what you'll find if you go over to podcast.gordon.edu. We will have links to the episodes that we talked about today. Now, please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are just so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Now, clearly, we're not stopping at 100. I can't wait to see what the next 100 unfold. So be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.